Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to make a start. I know people are still coming in from the meeting room onto this event, but we'll get underway as we're just after 1 o'clock. So good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, or PRONI, as we're more often known as, and also welcome you on behalf of our Engaged Communities group, of which is a part of the Department for Communities. PRONI sits within the Department for Communities. My name is David Huddleston, and I'm Acting Director of the Public Record Office and Deputy Keeper of the Records. I've had the privilege of working with Board of Guardian Records and PRONI over the past 20 years or so. This has included searching records to trace individuals who passed through the workhouse system, some who stayed briefly, and others who spent long periods of time within the workhouse. The address of the Belfast Workhouse remains ingrained on my memory: 51 Lisburn Road, Belfast, site of the current City Hospital. And often people were shocked and surprised to learn that a relative's birth or death certificate giving this address meant that an individual was born or had died in the Belfast Workhouse. Recent research by Professor Olwen Purdue of Queen's University Belfast has explored the provision of indoor relief through the Belfast Workhouse. It has shown the way that women who found themselves destitute in the city during the late 19th century used the institution as a means to survive. And if you're interested in finding out more about this particular topic, check out the PRONI YouTube channel for a conference entitled Exploring Victorian Belfast, People, Place and History, to which Professor Purdue contributed a presentation called Surviving the Industrial City, Women, Welfare and the Workhouse in Victorian Belfast. I especially want to acknowledge colleagues from across PRONI who worked together during the pandemic to digitise this important archive to make it more accessible, but also ensure that it is preserved for future generations as well. The Belfast Workhouse Indexes are a vital new resource for researchers, including genealogists and social historians. Workhouse records are unique and invaluable in that they often document the poorest and most marginalised members of society who are rarely referenced elsewhere in the written historical record. And this is particularly resonant as equality and social inclusion are core values within the Department for Communities, of which PRONI is a part. The ongoing popularity of family history highlights the continuing demand for publicly accessible digitised resources, and I'm delighted to begin 2022 by launching PRONI's latest addition to our own online collection. But that's really enough for me. I want to hand you over to Janet Hancock, Deputy Head of PRONI Public Services. Thank you for your attention and enjoy the rest of today's presentations. Over to you, Janet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Can everybody hear me and can everybody see the first slide of my presentation there okay? Yeah, I can see Joy nodding, thanks. Okay, you're very welcome, folks. So basically what I'm going to do is give you a little brief overview of the workhouse and the workhouse records in PRONI, show you a few examples of those and basically show you where you can go on the PRONI website to find the newly digitised indoor relief indexes for Belfast. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've gone on mute there. My computer was telling me I was muted there. So I'm just going to give, for anybody that's new and anybody who hasn't joined us before, you're particularly welcome, just a very quick overview of who we are and what we do at PRONI. We're the official archive for Northern Ireland, established in 1923, and we hold an excess of 3 million historical records, including records of public records. So those are records of government bodies, publicly funded organisations, of which the Board of Guardians would fall into that category, as well as a wealth of privately deposited material from individuals and organisations, the majority of which date from the 17th century onwards, but our earliest record does go back to 1219 in the 13th century. So in relation to the Board of Guardians, which is more commonly known as the workhouse or the poorhouse, I suppose sorry, apologies. To make a start with the background to that, the workhouse system was initiated following the Poor Law Act of 1838. So prior to the Great Famine in Ireland, the population was sitting at around 8 million, and 2/3 of the people in Ireland depended on agriculture, and the potato was their main source of food. The British government had assumed responsibility for Ireland after the Act of Union in 1800 created a united parliament. And there have been numerous inquiries commissioned in the early part of the 19th century to investigate the issue of poverty. So there was an awareness of this situation broadly, and there was debate about addressing poor in society in general. And that's broadly in line with sort of thinking at the time. You know, was that a Malthusian population crisis leading to this destitution? Was it because people were idle that they were poor, or was it because they were lacking in opportunity? So in 1833, the British government appointed a commission chaired by Archbishop of Dublin, Richard Whately. And that commission found that just under 2.5 million in Ireland were in want or distress for at least 30 weeks of the year. And it also found that the root cause of Irish poverty was not idleness, but the lack of work opportunities and an over-reliance on seasonal labouring opportunities. It also concluded that the English workhouse system, which was based on the 1834 new Poor Law in England, which brought about unions, Poor Law unions, and the workhouse system, whereby people would preferably be placed in a workhouse to actually do work if they were in need of poor relief. The Commission found that to be wholly unsuitable in the Irish situation and suggested that a remedy would be better to subsidise a scheme of public works and immigration. So the government didn't accept those findings and sent English Poor Law Commissioner George Nichols to investigate. Nichols did a whistle-stop tour of Ireland and swiftly recommended that the workhouse system in England would work in Ireland, although widely sort of considered in retrospect that this was widely based on analysis of the southwestern provinces and not a particularly comprehensive study. And he said it in his observation. Confinement of any kind is more irksome to an Irishman. He will not enter the workhouse unless thither for refuge or actual necessity. So despite considerable opposition for the aristocracy, who were also concerned about the financial implications that they would face, the bill was introduced in February 1837 and received royal assent in July 1838. So Ireland was divided into 137 unions based on market towns and electoral divisions, although this figure subsequently changed over time as unions divided or ceased to operate. 27 of those unions were in present-day Northern Ireland, and each union had its own workhouse. And Board of Guardians were elected or appointed for each union. So relief was to be financed almost entirely out of poor law rates, and this wasn't entirely welcome or useful, as many of the unions actually ended up bankrupt and in need of bailouts. But this example you'll see from the first appointment of Board of Guardians to Newry in 1839, 31 were elected, representing 23 electoral divisions as well as 10 ex officio appointments. So a young English architect called George Wilkinson designed the majority of Irish workhouses, and they were based on a standard model. And as David mentioned, many examples of these remain, including the Belfast Workhouse at 51 Lisburn Road, which I'm sure many of you will have seen as it now forms part of the city hospital grounds. Many workhouses subsequently went on to form part of more contemporary hospital buildings, as we'll touch on a bit later. But if anybody is familiar with Lisburn Hospital, you'll see another example there. But equally, in Derry, Londonderry, you'll also see the remnants of the workhouse there, alongside the theatre and Waterside Library on the Glendermot Road. So, inspired by fears of a population explosion of the destitute, The government was determined to make life in the workhouse as harsh as possible, so the poor didn't become dependent on handouts. The workhouse was designed to be a less attractive option than the very worst conditions outside, which actually proved difficult as the standard of living was already so poor in Ireland. Inmates had to work long hours, and families were separated on entry, with males and females housed in different quarters and children taken away from their parents. There were 7 classifications of inmates. That was old men, able-bodied men over 13, boys aged 7 to 13, old women, able-bodied women over 16, girls aged 7 to 16, and children under 7. Ventilation and sanitation were often poor, and dormitories were basic with planks and straws mattresses. And you can see a sort of a rough layout of the workhouse sort of campus, and you can see almost that line down the middle between male and female, and you can see an infirmary, a dead house, men's yard, women's yard, and the chapel and dining hall, etc. And you can sort of see from that front facade, based on the previous image, that sort of standard layout with which a lot of us are familiar. And this is a very rare example of a photograph from within the workhouse. And as you can see, taken at Christmas, you can see a very scary looking Santa in the background. But it gives some indication of the harsh conditions, and you can see sort of the dormitory style quarters. And again, as I mentioned, there were punishments for breaking the rules. If you have a look, the rules are fairly specific. You know, any pauper who shall neglect to observe such regulations, and they go on to say, shall make any noise when silence is ordered, shall use obscene or profane language, shall by word or deed insult or revile any person, shall threaten or strike or assault, etc., etc. And here's a little example from a punishment book from the Newry Workhouse, 1851 to 1852, and you'll probably not be able to see that on your screens, but a couple of examples. We have Owen Traynor, who was flogged for stealing onions, and James Hutchinson, who was confined to 6 hours lockup for going to a room without permission. So you can see it's pretty strict environment. So in terms of what PRONI holds, our archive covers the 27 union, which subsequently dropped down to 26. They're in the region of 14,000 records in that collection, and they cover a variety of things, including the administration of the workhouse, relief of the poor, issues relating to immigration, boarding out of children. They include minute books, indoor relief registers, outdoor relief registers, registers of births and deaths, admissions, discharges, vaccination records. There are complete sets of minute books from 1839 to 1948 for almost all of those unions. And where there are incomplete sets, only an occasional volume is missing. The Belfast Board of Guardians records span the period 1845 to 1932, also covering the well-known 1832 outdoor relief related civil unrest. So I touched on this again, but workhouses not only catered for the poor and destitute, workhouse infirmaries, workhouse had a health and welfare slant to them as well. And this is predominantly, as I mentioned, and as David mentioned, that the workhouses were in existence right up until the late 1940s, early 1950s, before they were subsequently, a lot of the functions were replaced by the National Health Service. But prior to that, you know, there were a lot of general issues which people went to the workhouse for that we kind of forget about, and we'll look at a few of those later. But in terms of welfare, they also had workhouse infirmaries were originally only intended for treatment of workhouses, but in 1851 the Medical Charities Act rationalised this haphazard treatment of poor patients who had previously only been entitled to treatment in the workhouse when they were inmates or via private charities. And George Wilkinson was again dispatched to build additional dispensaries. So by May 1852, Ireland was divided into 723 dispensary districts, 215 of which were in Ulster. A further extension to that act in 1862 extended Board of Guardians' powers to treat fever cases, and this was particularly significant in that it opened the workhouse hospitals to sick people who were not destitute. Also mentioned out the boarding of children. The 1862 Act also led to a new boarding out service, and this was largely due to the high infant mortality rates of motherless infants housed within the workhouse. And it initially covered children up to the age of 5, later extended to the age of 10 in 1969. The Pauper Children Acts of 1898 and 1902 further extended that age up to 15. And I think this is a really poignant example from Downpatrick Board of Guardians, where the letter says, "Dear Sir, I see in the paper you have 4 children to board out, and I would like to take them, and I will help. I will keep them clean and comfortable, and if I am spared my health, I will do my best to bring them up properly. I was speaking to Mr. Gibson about them. Would you kindly let me know?" And interesting that mentions an ad in the paper. So it sort of showed, people in the community were taking out boarded children, but it's quite a rare example to see something like that, and I think very poignant. Another example here from the Enniskillen Workhouse is a register of births. But sort of moving on, in terms of the main forms of relief, the 2 main forms of relief were indoor and outdoor, and I'll touch upon outdoor. This was not an original feature of the workhouse, but to relieve pressure in the workhouse, particularly in the wake of the famine. It was only brought into effect in 1847, and the Ulster Guardians proved less willing to grant outdoor relief to the unemployed than in other parts of the country. In Ulster, when they were given relief, often that relief was only given during the winter months, when the workhouses were overfull, and generally in the form of cooked food rather than the money, with the exception of Ballymoney, whose board gave out outdoor relief in money. But I think there's a lovely example here of the outdoor relief register, again from Downpatrick in 1854. You're probably not able to see this clearly, but the first entry up here is of a James Faluna. He's male, he's 99 years old when he's seeking outdoor relief. So outdoor relief basically meant that they weren't taken into the workhouse to live as an inmate. So he's 99 years old in 1854, which places him being born in and around the mid-1700s. So quite unusual and very difficult probably to find that individual anywhere else. He's from Ardglass. And then the next entry, Cicely Faluna, age 95, his wife. Again, so just a really interesting example of the quality of what you can find in the Board of Guardian records, particularly in relation to ancestors you might have difficulty tracing elsewhere. But moving on, I suppose the biggest part with which most of us are familiar is indoor relief within the workhouse. And that was really provision of food and shelter and living accommodations within the workhouse. And it was meant to be really only available for a small proportion of the truly destitute in exchange for hard work. So families had to be admitted as a group and were split up once inside. Individual family members were not eligible for relief. Food consisted of bread and porridge, or Indian meal or stirabout, and oatmeal replaced potatoes during the famine, and buttermilk and meat was much more seldom to appear on the menu. So Board of Guardians admission or indoor relief registers provide a range of details, and I'm just going to run through them here. So they give an entry number. So the indoor relief registers were organised by entry number chronologically in terms of when a person entered the workhouse. So if a register starts in January 1892, it systematically lists the next people to come in chronological order when they arrive, and each person as they arrived was allocated an entry number. The indoor relief registers, so the columns in those registers include name, surname and forename, their gender, their age, their marital status, their employment, their religion, whether or not they had any disability, the name of their spouse, the number of children, any other observations about them, their address, the date they were admitted, and the date that they either left at the workhouse or died. And not all of the registers include all of those details, but it gives you an idea of just the amount of detail you're likely to find. And I have a few examples to pull up where I can show you that in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to try and pop out of this screen share and try and share another example, so bear with me. So I'm hoping everyone can see that. And this is an example of an indoor relief register, and it's actually from Enniskillen Board of Guardians. And if you can all see that, here's some examples. So Gillespie John, male, 30, single, a beggar man, Roman Catholic. And you can see this is the particularly interesting bit as well. Here are some of the reasons why people find themselves in the workhouse. I think we often think of the workhouse in this sort of Oliver Twist-esque, you know, sort of vagrants and perhaps orphans. But as I said, the workhouse actually provided quite a substantial care function prior to things like the old age pension, unemployment benefit, disability benefit. People could find themselves in terrible need and very quickly if they were unable to work. And sometimes they were just unable to work for very straightforward reasons, such as a broken limb, or ladies who were pregnant, or a family where the husband is the main breadwinner had become unemployed or had a workplace injury and couldn't work, and the whole family found themselves in here. But equally, I thought this is, and you'll see the language used is not language we would use today, but you know, this guy, John Gillespie, is listed as an idiot. Other people listed as crippled. So you can see, you know, people with mental health issues, people with disabilities, and then, you know, more straightforward, disabled from sickness. And I'll show you a few examples of that. You know, yeah, people, yeah. So I think this gives a real insight. Somebody who'd burned their foot. So the idea that people were in here because they were unwilling to work, or they were, you know, sort of a drain on society for reasons of their own making, is sort of really dispelled by what you see in the contents. In the contents of these examples. Now I'm going to try and go back into my presentation here briefly. So can everybody see that again? Okay. So we've seen a few examples. So sort of moving that on, you can see the volume of information that it's possible to find in the indoor registers. And Belfast in particular, as one of the largest unions, because of the way the registers were organised and the sheer volume of people that were passing through the workhouse system, as you can imagine, quite unwieldy to try and find an individual entry maybe from before. So Belfast Union actually have index books running from the 1890s onwards. So basically the index is an alphabetical index by surname, running concurrently with the indoor relief registers. So in the index, if you can see in this example, you have the forename and surname, you have the age, and crucially, you have the entry number. So if you look at this example for July 1892, and you're looking at the entrant here. So for example, if you're looking for Mary Boyle, you can see her entry number is 48. So if you were to go to the Indoor Relief Register covering July 1892 and you were to go to entry 48, you should find further details about Mary Boyle. And this is why this resource is such a value, because it makes finding people so much easier in terms of location, not having to troll through. You can quickly identify whether a name appears in the index. So the end of the workhouse in 1872, the Poor Law Commissioners were dissolved and the local government board was established. In 1898, the Local Government Act reduced the power of the Board of Guardians, reverting their duties back to relief of the poor and transferring other functions to county hospitals, you know, and that started to cover things like asylums and fever hospitals, and as sort of thinking on social conditions progressed in the early part of the 20th century, that included specialized care for people with you know, particular difficulties, as I said, in like mental health, blindness, deafness, etc., particular disabilities. And in terms of access, just to mention, so any registers containing personal details where the last entry of the register is over 100 years old are generally open in relation to the Board of Guardian archive, but where entries are named individuals, entries are less than 100 years old, those remain closed, and that is to protect the personal data of potentially living individuals, because they do registers do contain examples of extreme destitution and disease and illness and illegitimacy and lots of things. And I think there has also been a stigma attached to the workhouse that wouldn't have been discussed in families often because of that. And it's really only recently that we've started to better understand social welfare and provision and social care, and with a bit of distance removed from the closure of the institutions, that people have really been finding a growing interest and sort of finding out maybe retrospectively that they have an ancestor who, for whatever reason, passed through the Board of Guard system. And like I said, the indexes that we have digitised and made available contain in excess of 450,000 named individuals. So that is a lot of people passing through the workhouse system even during that period of time. But yes, so just because the more recent records are closed, you can, if you're looking for a particular individual, make a written request to PRONI for information, and PRONI will consider that under sort of current access to information legislation, and there's no charge for that service. So that brings us on to the PRONI website, and I'm going to flick out of my slideshow and I'm just going to give you a very quick demonstration of where you can find the indexes. Sorry, it's having to juggle between too many things is causing my difficulties here. Okay, can everyone see that? We're on the PRONI website. So some of you are more than likely familiar with this, but the indexes that have been digitised are located within the eCatalogue. So if you click into the eCatalogue and you go to search the eCatalogue, and you go down to the big green search the eCatalogue button, and that will take you into PRONI's main search page. So you have a number of options as to how you will find information in the Board of Guardians archive. So I'm going to show you the general way to browse information in the whole collection. So if you use the browse function, and if you go to B, which stands for Board of Guardians, and you go to BG for Board of Guardians, you will be able to see the entire selection of 46 different boards entries related, listed in the archive. And you can see Antrim Board, Armagh Board, Ballycastle, Ballymena, etc. They're generally listed alphabetically with a few later additions added in there at the end. But for example, BG7 relates to Belfast Board of Guardians. So if you click down into BG7, you'll then see the types of records listed individually. So we've got minute books, contagious diseases, traders, general ledgers. If you flick forward into a few of the later categories, BG7 bar G is where you'll find the indoor relief register lists. And again, you can look through and you can see that those registers start from 1864 and work their way forward. So obviously these are available to consult. The open records are available to consult. So those prior to 1921 are available to consult. If you visit PRONI, you can come along and order out those individual volumes. If you want to move back up, you can use the browse function to do so. And here we have the BG7 GK indoor relief indexes. And as you can see then, you can navigate your way to any of the digitized records here by hitting view record, and it will ask you to agree to a copying and copyright statement, and then it will open a PDF. So here we can see an example. I hope you can all see this, of how the digitized record looks. And obviously you can use your zoom button to increase the visibility on that a lot better. Again, you've got the entry number in the register. This starts in July 92. You've got Alice Anderson, age 21. And you've got a few, I noted a few interesting things just by the very first glance is the range of ages of people, and you can clearly see families. So you've got Nellie Anderson, age 25, and what are obviously her two children, Matthew, aged 2.5, and Robert John, aged 8 days. Equally, you've got a Margaret Adgie a little bit further down. She's aged 73, and her volume entry number is 3,225. But interestingly, if you look back into the other column, I also noted that Margaret Adgie is also listed in another entry, entry 646. Again, Margaret Adgie, 73, more than likely the same person. And this is an example of where people may have habitually been required to go in and out of the workhouse, and in multiple occasions. They'd go for a while when they were in dire straits, they'd come out again, they would find themselves in difficulties and go back in again. So the indexes are particularly useful in this instance because you can see often the same people recorded on multiple occasions, and again that's more difficult to nail down without going through the registers page by page by page. So I'm going to go back out into the catalogue again, and I'm going to go back to the search. So if you hit the search rather than the browse, the most straightforward way to find all of these indoor relief indexes is by going to the PRONI reference box, typing BG /, so BG is Board of Guardians, /7, which is Belfast Board of Guardians, /GK, which is the section of the archive that relates to indoor relief registers. And if you just put an asterisk after that, that will search for everything that comes within that portion of that particular archive. And as you can see, that will take you directly to the list, and you can browse your way through for the particular dates. If I go back to search again, if I know exactly the date I'm looking for, or I know exactly the register, the PRONI reference for a register, I can put that in full. So if I go BG /7 /GK /1, for example, if I was looking for the register for 1892 and I know that's the correct reference, it will bring me back that specific index, and again I can go through and I can access it in that way. So really that's been a bit of a whistle stop tour around a bit of background to Board of Guardians and workhouses, a bit of an insight into what type of information you can find, particularly within the registers, and a little bit of an overview about how you navigate the PRONI eCatalogue in order to find this information. So really, I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to pass you across to my colleague Joy Carey, who is going to talk to you a little bit about all of the hard work that went into preparation and digitisation of these indexes. And then hopefully if we have any questions that haven't been answered in the chat, we'll try and get to those afterwards. So I'm going to pass across to Joy.
Thank you very much, Janet. Can everybody hear me okay? Just give me a nod. Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to share my screen now too. I've prepared a few slides for you. I'll just play that. Okay, you should see a big purpley blue slide. Yeah, that's great. So my name's Joy Carey, and I head up the reprographics unit in PRONI, which is where we digitise the records. You maybe see in the background here, I'm sitting in the office, so you can see some of the camera equipment there behind me. So the first slide, just a little bit of background on why we digitise records to begin with. Obviously, we provide better and wider access to our originals if we can put them online. We can also create print copies. We can email images out to people if they need something, or as in the case of these BG index books, we can put the digitized images on the internet for people to look at all over the world. And it's great now that we can actually attach things to our online catalogue and people can access them that way. So that's a real step forward for us in the last few years. Digitisation also ensures the better preservation of the original material because people can access that high quality digital reproduction instead of handling the original material. When the originals are handled less, it means there's much less risk of them being damaged. So for example, these examples that I've put on the screen here, this central image is a glass plate negative, just a photograph of the actual object as you would see it in our stores. So that's made of glass, about maybe 3-4 millimeters thick. We obviously can't bring that out to someone in the reading room because it's dangerous, and also we wouldn't want it to get broken. So we can digitize that negative, produce a lovely positive copy like the one on the right hand side, and then we can provide print copies of that, or we can put that type of material up on the internet then. So that's providing access to something through digitization which previously just we couldn't provide you access to at all. So you wonder why I'm putting up a conservation slide to begin with, but really good digitization, and if you're going to do a project really well, it's all about the preparation, what you put in beforehand, that gets a good outcome. So we actually start in conservation. So these few photographs are of conservators working in our conservation studio next door to me here. What we ask them to do is carry out a condition assessment of the material that we've selected to be digitized. So they will determine whether the original items are stable enough in their condition to be digitized straight away, or whether they perhaps need some intervention or treatment by a conservator before we can digitize them. Often they'll also give us some advice on how we should handle the records while they're being digitized, or they'll perhaps provide us with some supports or make us some bespoke supports in order to digitize them, carrying out the least possible risk of damage to the records. Then the next step is we have to ensure that the record series is completely catalogued. Down to item level is preferable really when we're going to digitize records. We need to be able to match up the digital images that we produce with the originals, and the way we do that is through their unique catalogue reference number. So if we have, for example, a collection of records which haven't been catalogued, that causes a problem for us because then we end up with images and we don't know what to name them that will match with the originals, and then sometimes there's a bit of work we have to do afterwards, which isn't ideal. So we prefer that everything's catalogued to item level first. Then we come into where we are today, into the reprographics studio, and we've got various pieces of equipment that we use for digitizing different formats of records. We have to choose and select the right piece of equipment for each job so that we don't cause any damage to the original, so that it's handled and touched either by human hand or by machine as little as possible. and we select that equipment according to the size of it. So sometimes we have very outsized material to digitize, very large maps, for example. The format of the records, so if they're in a bound volume, for example, it causes different issues for us than single sheet material does. And also the fragility of the material is important. The digital camera system you see there on the top left, it's the one that's behind me now, is what would have been used to digitize the BG index books that are being launched today. Usually, if we're digitizing bound volumes, we would try and use a book scanner, like the one that's on the right-hand side of the screen there, but the BG index books are actually physically quite long and tall, and they would have been too large for that machine, so we did them under the camera system instead. So once we've actually taken the images, there's a lot of quality assurance has to go on. We have to apply good records management to the collection of images that we create. So we need to make sure that we have the right folder structures in place, and so they're stored in a way which makes sense to people. So that it's not just my team that can understand it, but everybody, if they're looking at them again, can understand what's been done. Then we quality assure all the images after an item's been digitized. We want to make sure all the content's there. No pages have been turned, 2 pages turned over at once and we've left something out. We have to make sure there's no focus issues. There's nothing out of focus, no under or overexposure. We want to check the file naming conventions have been adhered to so that we have that unique, the identification through the reference number in the catalogue. Then we save different renditions of that image. We save a very high quality TIFF resolution, high resolution TIFF, master copy, and that will be digitally preserved by another team in our digital preservation system. And then from that digital master, we can produce copies, which are usually smaller JPEG access copies for different uses, such as putting them online. If we tried to put our TIFF masters online, it would take an awful long time for people to download them. It just wouldn't work. So that work has to go on to quality assure everything. The digital records, we end up with a whole series of JPEG images of each page of each book, and then we combine those into an individual single PDF file of multiple images, which are then you can scroll down through the pages of the book, and our digital preservation team put those access copies on our online catalogue, attach them to the catalogue. I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than just saying they attach them to the catalogue, but that's what they do. And then you can view them at home. So that's the end of my little section. So I'll hand back to Janet, and if there's any questions about this, you can ask me in the chat. Thank you very much.